Hi there, and welcome to It Takes Two. This is the segment where one of us shows the other person a film that they really, really love. And so, Ethan, what did you have me watch this week?
So I had you watch Tomás Gutiérrez Alea's 1968 Cuban film, Memories of Underdevelopment.
Desde que se quemó el encanto, La Habana parece una ciudad de provincia. Pensar que antes la llamaban el París del Caribe. Al menos así le decían los turistas y las putas. Ahora más bien parece una Tegucigalpa del Caribe.
So I chose this for you. Perhaps lazily, it was the first film that I saw on my shelf, but I also
Gee, thanks.
But I also think it's an extraordinary film, and I think it's one of the great instances of subjectivity being utilized incredibly creatively on film. I think in a piece of writing I did about this, I called it Mrs. Dalloway for a post-Bay of Pigs world. I think that interior aspect really is something that Alea puts his own unique stamp on, and I wanted to see what your reaction was to a film being so oriented around one person's viewpoint, but also these kind of exterior media choices that Alea decides to put into the film.
Yeah, it's really curious because this film takes place in 1961, right in the heart of the Bay of Pigs incident. Castro's come to power 2 years earlier, and it circles around Sergio, who is, if you're going to tell a story about Cuba in 1961, I would not, if I were directing it, I would not pick this character
Really?
to tell the story. Yeah, it's so curious because he's someone who he's part of the kind of the elite of Cuba, and he's someone who thrived on the previous system before Castro. He's a pre-revolutionary figure, and he's someone who would you describe it as detesting the revolution, or at least feeling indifferent to it?
I feel like he's much more critical of it than someone from the position of a person of a lower class, or someone who believes in these kind of Marxist values wholeheartedly that Castro and Che Guevara endorsed before the revolution. I think his material wealth, or relative...
He's a landlord.
He's a landlord. He has multiple apartments throughout the city, and he actually, for a lot of the movie, is kind of sequestered within this small apartment that he owns that is actually above Cuba. One of the aspects that I think I wanted to talk about, having revisited this film, was the use of voyeuristic tactics. Sergio is someone who looks a lot but does not act. We have a lot of instances of voiceover. We have a lot of instances in those apartment scenes of him looking through a telescope.
El titán de bronce. Cuba libre e independiente. ¿Quién iba a sospechar todo esto? Sin el águila imperial. Y la paloma que iba a mandar Picasso. Muy cómodo eso de ser comunista y millonario en París.
We have a lot of distancing devices, whether through film, audio. I'm thinking specifically of his recording his wife,
Right.
and that scene that recurs twice over throughout the film. I wanted to get your take on that because that struck me really powerfully going back to this film. Initially, I was like, oh, it's a collage, but looking through it this time, I thought it just adds to this subjective tonality of a man who doesn't really know what he wants. It's kind of Hamlet-esque, except without the murder.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's really curious that you bring up the point about looking, because I think I also want to say that one of my favorite parts of the film is when he goes to Ernest Hemingway's house
Yes.
just outside of Havana in San Francisco de Paulo or something like that. And it's funny because that house is actually called in Spanish the Looking House. And there's a whole part in the movie where he's actually, Sergio's hiding from his lover, Elena, in Hemingway's tower. And there are so many instances, like you said, where he's looking down upon Cuba, he's judging it, he's constantly calling it underdeveloped. He says that a million times in the film, and it's the title of the film. So it's funny because I think that he kind of takes he's at least operating in the observational framework of a colonizer, or at least an imperial elitist. Even though he's Cuban himself, he really has none of the power, but he partakes in the gaze like an imperialist or a colonizer, like Hemingway.
Or as an author. I think this film is as much Alea's vision, obviously it's Alea's vision, but it's kind of compiled through Sergio's opinions. And I think one of the interesting things that you said about colonizing, there's multiple instances where Sergio goes into bookstores and picks out specifically European texts.
Yes.
Lolita is one of the texts that he picks up, and I can't remember the second one, but you mentioned
The Moral of the Bourgeoisie, I think.
Yes, so I think there's, again, another distancing device, and I think that might be one of the reasons why this film is kind of difficult to get into, because it's such a detached viewpoint, even from a protagonist who is as passionate about his own life as he is. I think going along these lines about colonizing and having these issues of power, what did you take about the differing relationships that Sergio has with women? There's three, I think, central relationships, one of which takes place almost entirely off screen with his wife, but also with Elena, the woman that he has some romantic dalliances with, and his housemaid, or some type of domestic worker that keeps up the apartment. I want to get your take on that, because that's part of the film that's difficult for me to reconcile and pin down exactly what I think Alea is doing in those passages.
Yeah, I've been kind of thinking about that. I kind of wonder, because the film opens on this kind of mass exodus from Cuba, where Sergio's family and his ex-wife leave to go to the United States, and I kind of think that his relationship both with the housekeeper and with Elena kind of come from this sense that Cuba is now in chaos. And sure, Sergio can go walking the streets and pick up women by saying, "Oh, you have nice kneecaps." So I guess he's kind of participating in the chaos of it all. And you could say that his relationship with his wife is perhaps Alea at least trying to comment on the kind of European order that Sergio's life had before this kind of whole Bay of Pigs situation kind of took place.
I think that's really interesting. I think specifically, as we kind of move to the tail end of the discussion, the Bay of Pigs incident, the final shot of this, I think, is one of the great instances of just a final sequence in general. Him looking out, or the camera, because we don't see Sergio actually looking out at the city of Havana, but the people arming for some sort of conflict. And we're imagining this is going to be the missile crisis or something akin to that. And I find it really interesting. Sergio is kind of so distanced himself from the context that he exists in, but that context still informs his life, even if he doesn't think specifically that that's what he believes in. There's an instance earlier where he's at a lecture with multiple Cuban authors, and they're talking about the underdeveloped state of Cuban literature, or Latin American literature in general. And a man stands up and he's like, "This is anemic, and the discussion isn't going anywhere, it's not informing anything." And Sergio's like, "Yeah, that's right." But it's still a context that he exists in. So simultaneously, while the film's main protagonist is pushing everything away, Alea is allowing a lot of that stuff to inform our understanding of the character's interior life, whether it be the relationships with women, the references to European literature and ideologies, or just world events in general. We get a lot of coverage about the Bay of Pigs through documentary footage. We get Castro talking specifically within the film.
We get Kennedy voiceover
toward the end. And I think that's the dichotomy between that, what Sergio wants to let into his life and what is actually informing his context and how he deals with the world. I think specifically your point about the women in his life is that even he's trying to frame it through this ideological lens, but it's a relationship that grows and is organic, which reflects upon the sterility of his own life. Again, kind of going back to these Galloway comparisons about the sterility of the main character, but the vast interior ways in which that character can be expressed outside of just being deflated and defeated.
Well, I gotta say, thank you for sharing this movie with me. I really did like it, especially that middle section. Yeah, it's not a film that I would say is about Cuba itself. It's more of a film about elitism and its relation to revolution. Would you agree with that?
I could agree with that. I think there's enough within the film to warrant a reading about the state of Cuban history at this point in time, but I think as well just how much Sergio is oriented around the thematic and kind of plot and character center of the film, I think makes the film much more about what he's talking about rather than just specifically what Cuba is, which would be much more like we'd have to watch I Am Cuba by a Soviet director, Mikhail Kalatozov, which is from a similar time period, but obviously kind of more tied into what people thought Cuba was at this point in history.
Well, you can hear it from me first. You should check out this film, Memories of Underdevelopment. But with that, I think that's all we have to say. So see you next time. Bye-bye.